I'm very happy to be here and to be talking this morning to you about this concept of the learning family enterprise, because I think in the modern era and moving forward, knowing how as individuals to be learning as a lifelong exercise, but also to have families together, being a learning family enterprise together, is really, really important. One of the things that I noticed in the Strengths Finder exercise that we did the first afternoon is, did you notice how many times people had learner as part of their top 5 strengths? And I think that part of what draws us to the field and to working with families is learning more and more. The field is developing. It's really a very young field in many ways still. And I think this is a very exciting time in the field where we are building a body of knowledge and a set of skills together. So it's an exciting time. Another aspect of the nice time is it's really nice to have summer finally here, right? We've had a wet, cold spring many places. And, you know, when summer is here and the time is right for a lot of different things, what do you think of? I mean, what do your thoughts tend to turn to as one of the most important aspects of summer? It's, it's beer. And it's funny, I grew up in the Midwest of the U.S., Northeast Ohio, and in the Midwest, Stroh's beer was pretty prominent. You may have experience with this as well. But one of the reasons why I actually wanted to bring up the idea of Stroh's, some of you may be aware that actually there has been a book written recently by a member of the Stroh's family, Francis Stroh. Have anybody seen the book yet? It's relatively new. A few of you have. Okay, good. The book details in painful detail the struggles and basically all the mistakes that you can make in a family enterprise. The lack of transparency, the lack of preparation for wealth skills, the not great governance, basically all the things that go into our classic shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. And lo and behold, things fell apart. So if you want to have a good telling tale of what you should not do, Francis Stroh has written a book that exemplifies these things. But what we're here for, and one of the nice things about the way the field is going now, is we're moving away from the dire, scare people, scare families, shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. You better watch out. You better do the right things. From a fear-based kind of approach to, well, what is it you have to do? And what about those families who are successful, as we have heard throughout the symposium in the last couple of days? What about the ones who actually do make it? What are their qualities and characteristics? And so I'm going to be talking about a core component of becoming a learning family enterprise. Because in my work with families and in training advisors, I personally have come to see that when families are curious and when they work together to try and learn together in an ongoing way across generations and across members of the family within a generation, they do tend to thrive, and certain things tend to happen that are good. In thinking about the talk for today, I went back and I thought about the literature, I thought about the body of knowledge. There's actually not a lot that's been written about learning organizations and learning family enterprises. And interestingly, I kept coming back to something that kept drawing my attention. And the reality is that it actually comes from FEX. The Learning Continuum that has been developed and that is part of what you work on, what guides your learning, what you talk about. is actually a really good paradigm. And there it is. The levels of learning, the domains of learning for family enterprise members, the inclusion of advisor members. I mean, I want to commend you and say it actually has many good aspects in organizing the domains that need to be understood at the levels from more fundamental to more advanced of what needs to be done. You've done a really good job with this. And as I looked at this, I realized that this formed a basis in my mind of what actually is the foundation for a learning family enterprise. And so I'm going to work with this just for a moment. What I need to do, though, is because I'm going to be focusing on the family enterprise, and not so much of the advisors who are alongside families as we work, I'm going to sort of momentarily say, for you advisors in the room, I'd like to just put you on the side for a second. You don't have to go anywhere. You get to stay put. But I'm going to be really focusing on the family. I'm going to be bringing you advisors back in later on at particular points. And you can listen. And I think actually the more that you understand what families have to do and the more that you can help them with what they have to do, the better. But just for a few minutes, I'm going to be really focusing on the families in the room and the family enterprises as the core of what we talk about. As I looked at the Learning Continuum, one of the things that struck me was it does have an emphasis on the individual, on family members. Now, obviously, family members can work together, learn together, but that the emphasis on members going from more fundamental to integrative to advanced in the capacity and competency domains that are talked about. And what I'm going to be talking about, in a sense, is an expansion on this model, which is that if you imagine, if you take and you include all the members in the family or key members in the family, because sometimes there are people who are more family champions, family leaders who are a bit more ahead in the learning. And if you put them together and have certain characteristics of their collaboration, what do you get? You actually get the learning family enterprise as each member makes progress. And so the circular, collaborative effect, where the learning of different members enhances the learning of other members, people learn together, and it creates skills together, is what fosters a learning family enterprise. To emphasize the importance of this, I'm going to talk about something that some of you probably already know about. How many of you know about the 100-Year Families Research Project? Okay, a few of you. I would really encourage you, this is an ongoing project by a colleague of mine, Dennis Jaffe, Wise Counsel Research. I have been involved with it also at various times. And what's interesting is this is a research project that does exactly what I said before. It doesn't say, oh, 5% survive to, year 3 and whatever we hear for statistics. It's like, wait a minute, let's look at families who've gone through a minimum of 2 generational transitions. Not just 1, but 2. And let's look at these families, and let's interview them and find out what is it that they have done that has helped. What do they attribute their success to? And so in understanding these, what you might think of as generative families, in the research project so far, we have over 70 families, and globally. Majority are from North America, but actually we're including families from the globe, with control in G3 or later. They are generally thriving businesses with over 200 million US in revenues, at least. They identify themselves, kind of like the DeKuyper family, as an extended family. They have a strong family identity. And this is an interview format in which we basically look at narratives, not just statistics. And we focus on how do they do things, not just what did they do. It's not, did you form a family council? It's, when you formed a family council, what was that like? How did you do that? How did you deal with the stresses that came up, the challenges? How did you deal with it? It was the how. And I think we all are interested very much in the how, not just the what. We try generally to interview at least 2 generations from the same family. So far we have 20 countries represented. Half of the families that we are talking to have already sold their original legacy business. And that's important because it means they have begun to let go of the original operating company that may have been part of their founding, of their immigration to the land of wealth. And they have gone from either a business-owning family to being a wealth-owning family, but more often, they're just in other businesses. And the newest research that some of you may know is, don't look at the business and whether it survives. Focus on the family, because the family is an entrepreneurial engine that is creating multiple businesses. And so what are the secrets that we're finding of the generative family that leads to what I'm going to be talking about of actually elements that go into the learning family enterprise? Well, the basic idea that we're finding so far is that the first part of the process of the family is that the founders build a great business. But the key transition for generative families is that they go on to build a great family. And it is that transition from the original focus on being the business to really understanding how the focus needs to be on the family and how the family functions is one of the key findings that's coming out of the 100-year family research. What do generative families do? Number one, they engage together. They gather and interact as a family in a purposeful way. They have transparency. They talk about the business and the family. And as some of you know, Dennis and I actually are becoming more and more interested in the cultural aspects of global families and have written a book, Cross Cultures. And so I want to just mention here, there are some families in which transparency is not part of the family culture to as great a degree as in individualist Western families. But what we're finding that's interesting is they know how it's culturally normative, and they know how to deal with less transparency. And in the modern world, what they're finding is that they're migrating toward greater transparency for a variety of reasons. It's a very fascinating finding, and it relates to the globalization of cultures in the world. They create opportunities, and they do special events together in order to grow the family and to learn together at some of these events. They learn together. They have shared education. They have specific activities, more than beyond just the sort of financial education of the young people in the family. They actively do things related to education. That's one of the things I wanted to underline for you. And finally, they work on development. I mean, all the things that we heard about yesterday. They do mentoring, they do career development for young people. None of this is, in a sense, rocket science or unusual. But what I wanted to show you is we're getting confirming evidence that families that survive into G5, G6, G7 do the things that make sense for healthy families. And so, if we look then at what generative families do, if we go back to this compared to what I just showed you. If you see these, you can see that many elements from here are occurring. But as I said, they're occurring at the individual level. And one of the things that Dennis and I have talked about quite a bit is, in general, families, in adapting over time, need to strike a balance between two major themes. They need to be focusing on the individual skills for the independence of each member in the family. So you can come into adult life and have the competencies needed to run your life and do well in your own life, as are listed here and very consistent with what FEX has done in the Learning Continuum. But the extra element, and this is what I want to bring in now, which is in a family enterprise, when you have shared assets and you have to work together, what is the other set of capacities that you need? So we have the independence of each family member, and what I was building up very well to was the family-wide skills for the interdependence of the family. The family has to be managing the focus on the we and on the me, and that has to be in balance. And so that's where you need to have the learning family enterprise. And so when we have, a happy family who is working together and enjoying being together and learning together, and I, like to insert the obligatory stock photo of the happy family, so we're going to make that go away, and there's my happy family. Nice white. My guess is none of these people know each other. They just got, they just brought them together for the picture. Say, oh, you're a good-looking model, like that. But a happy family, learning together in front of the camera. So what makes for a learning family enterprise? Let's walk through and look at some specifics. I would suggest if you are totally fascinated by what I'm talking about and you are still awake this morning, that you should look at an article by David Galvin that dates back to 1993, which is like, 50 years in dog years or family enterprise learning years. In this article, which I always really liked and I keep in mind, I want you to listen to what he says makes for a learning organization. A learning organization is skilled at creating, acquiring, and transferring knowledge, and at modifying its behavior to reflect new knowledge and insights. Just think about that. Creating, acquiring, and transferring knowledge, and at modifying its behavior to reflect this learning. What you've got here are the themes that we often talk about, which is it's a combination of knowledge and skills. You have to have both. One or the other is not sufficient. And so, what goes into this process for families? One of the things that David Garvin's article talks about is that there are some core components to what goes on. Systematic problem solving, experimentation, learning from past experiences, learning from others, and transferring knowledge. I'm going to be going through and talking about these in detail regarding families, but I'm also going to be adding one more, which I think is crucial to a learning family enterprise. And as we talk about it, I think we have seen it over the course of the past couple of days when families have worked on it. But I'm going to be adding it in because I think that there is one extra element. And see if you can think of what that might be or how you would add to it, because there's actually something that I feel is missing from this, that when you add it together, you really create a family that does well together. Okay, so let's look at the first part, which is systematic problem solving. Think either of your own family or of the families that you work with. Advisors, I'm talking to you now, okay? You're still here. Families that work effectively together generally do a methodical process and disciplined thinking when they work on things together in a family council or whatever that they do. Now, many entrepreneurs have their own methodical, disciplined thinking. It just happens in their head, and then they announce it or talk about it or whatever. But learning family enterprises and families that collaborate together often really stick to a solid, good process that keeps them out of trouble. They take an organized approach to information. Because, you know, in a family enterprise, you're getting a lot of information in. You have to process many things very rapidly in real time, and you have to make decisions and come up with actions. And so families that tend to do this in a more of an organized, methodical way have an advantage. I've worked with many families and family councils, and one of the things that I watch for and notice is, does the family council rely on their gut, intuition, or do they follow data? Do they try and get information to help with their decision making? And Vanessa Strike, I don't know if you are here in this room, but we were talking, Vanessa has a wonderful article about sense making and how advisors often help families with being aware of making sense of the things that they are working on and of the world around them, and to help and tweak and watch, making sure that decision-making is occurring not by rules of thumb, which may be out of date or inaccurate, but by helping people stay on track with database sorts of things as well as others. A learning family organization, and an effective one that has a disciplined approach, strikes the balance between doing decision-making, which is impulsive and overly fast, and paralyzed and somewhat slow and protracted. I was recently working with a family in North America and helping them with developing their family governance. And in the course of trying to work through some of the components of the family constitution and what might be in it, at one point we were talking, or they were talking about, well, how many people should be a quorum? You know, if the council is together, how many people should be there if they're going to make a decision? And somebody said, well, you know, I think 3 people should be there. And other people said, well, okay, yeah, that sounds good. And then they started writing it down. And I said, excuse me, could you just like wait a minute on that? Could you talk about that a little more? Because what you were saying and what you may memorialize here, this is going to have an effect on things, and at some point the family may bump up against what you just decided here. Like, have you really thought that through? What would that mean? And it's funny because we were actually doing this over video, and like all the heads swirled up to the webcam. It's like, oh, yeah, we did that kind of fast, didn't we? And then they spent 10 minutes talking about it. And in the end, they made a slight adjustment to their decision. They knew what they were doing, and they moved on. And what was interesting was at the end of the task force meeting that we had, they talked about that as, that was a really significant event. That it's like, thank you for slowing us down. We tend to do that. And we don't realize when we do that. What they were afraid of is a long, protracted, sort of work by committee kind of a thing. And I tried to help them. There's a difference between that slow and decisive process and kind of going too fast. See if you can find it. And since then, they have talked about as one of the most important things that they have learned. And they talked about it to the family assembly when they gave their presentation as an example of what's going on as they are learning. So families that learn to strike that balance between going too quick and taking too long are ones that have a healthy process. Families that hold each other accountable to having a process and using it also do well. In the example that I just gave you, I've done that with many families. And what I watch for is, does the group over time start to hold each other accountable, that when an event comes up and somebody says, well, let's just do it this way, and they say, okay, either because they want to avoid conflict or something else, somebody else at the table says, excuse me, wait a minute, we just did that kind of fast. Can we think about that a little bit? Can we talk about that? And they begin to internalize the process. That's good. Number 2, experimentation. Experimentation can get very problematic in family enterprises. And we have been hearing wonderful things about intrapreneurship, entrepreneurship, and the entrepreneurship theme that we started off with for this symposium, which is fantastic. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about when family business owners don't want to retire and the generational stresses that occur. I don't know how many people saw that. It was maybe a month ago. And a lot of what they talked about was the struggles going on between the rising generation and the baby boomer generation. Again, I'm a baby boomer and stuff. It's like we are the center of the universe. It is about us. And it's getting to not be so much about us. And I don't think we like that. But it is life. And so what was interesting is my eye was caught by a quotation as they were interviewing the next generation young lady there who was taking over, well, not yet taking over the business, and her father. And they were talking about various things, and it was classic. They were asking about the tensions of the family, and Ms. Stable in the article said, well, the big tension is the hesitation of older generations to move into something different. I thought she was being very diplomatic. When asked if she would like to expand overseas, Ms. Stable said, perhaps eventually. And her father said, after I'm gone, how will she cope and handle the process until he's gone? How will this affect when he's gone? How long will the organization have to wait to do an expansion until he's gone? So being able to tolerate and think about an ongoing willingness to learn and to share and to manage risk. Because interestingly, I find many entrepreneurs took huge risks early on in the development of the business. And then they get to a certain point, and they actually sometimes become very risk averse. And they want to manage all risk. And how families manage risk together is a key issue. For the elder generation, which is really bizarre to think that, we are becoming the elder generation. But for the elder generation, one of the important shifts is to begin to shift from the literal aspect of paternalism, which is doing for others, taking care of others in a benevolent way, but nevertheless taking care of others, to make the shift as a life stage transition to becoming a mentor. And I find when I work with families that one of the most important aspects is the degree to which the family, patriarch or matriarch, is willing and able to make that shift. It's a hard shift to make when you're older. And some people are ready for the generativity phase and all that, but many people are not. They're locked into their identity as the doer and the one who takes care. For those who have more flexibility and able to make the shift, it's easier. And for the rising generation, there is the need to balance respect and, in a certain way, deference to elders with the reality that assertiveness very often is needed. And for the younger generation, when I work with young rising family leaders, what I try to help them with is how to strike that balance of being respectful and yet finding their voice and being able to be assertive. Openness to small experiments is part of long-term development, trial and error sorts of things, and a willingness to then move up to larger demonstration projects as you begin to see how things are working. And again, we have heard this over the course of the past several days. Learning from past experiences. I'm going to show several things here. Not only do families that are learning family enterprises look at the successes and look at what made this go well, and they create and implement best practices, but they actually spend a lot of time looking at mistakes and failures, and they see them as productive, that there's actually information is contained in every failure or mistake. I want to say that again. In every failure or mistake, there is information. And your job is to find out what the information is. That, in many ways, families that embrace mistakes, which is, a common buzzword now. You have to fail frequently, fail a lot, and whatever. But the idea is embracing mistakes without blaming, without a blaming culture in the family. Tolerating, in fact, the analysis of failures, because a lot of families and family councils will shy away from talking about mistakes and failures. They're afraid of it because it's going to lead to conflict. They're afraid about blaming. There's a lot of things about that that are difficult. Families that learn how to have the conversation without falling into blaming and finger pointing do much better. In other words, you got to build a thick skin, and you need to have good risk management. Learning from others. Learning organizations cultivate the art of open, attentive listening. It's a key factor. And so, obviously, learning organizations have openness and collaboration, both within the family, through the mentoring process that goes on among everybody, and outside the family. And this is where you guys come in again. The collaboration with advisors, organizations like this, peer networks. So, for those of you advisors in the room, I told you to kind of be back in here again, and this is where you are so important. Families that have great advisors and are open to learning, and at the right time and opportunity that you provide some of this help, you help the family be a learning family enterprise. But for a family to be connected and to learn from others, including other families like themselves, facilitates the process. Transferring knowledge. Remember, it's not just gaining knowledge, but it's being able to pass it on. There is generally a culture of sharing information and transparency with methods for doing that through all the various things that we know about. Family councils and family assemblies that take an educational approach and have learning built in as part of the processes leverage the opportunity when they're together of moving the family forward together. Families that have education programs, not only for the rising generation, but I really strongly believe, and many of you know this from my writing, that how a family handles taking in new members from the outside, those immigrants to the family to wealth who come in from middle-class life and enter the family business, who are totally bewildered at what they've come into and need orientation. Families tend to do better when they understand the in-laws and spouses needing education, not just the young people coming up from within the family. In today's world, particularly with digital technology and the need for rapid learning, all of these things are so much more important. So when learning is woven into the family life, as you can see, through all levels, you're developing a learning family enterprise. Now, I said when I started talking that I think that there's one more element that is key that I did not see listed in this article: learning from conflict. Just think about that. One of the most difficult and yet one of the most profound aspects of a learning family enterprise and a family that is able to prosper across generations is understanding how to manage and work with conflict and to see conflict as an opportunity for learning. And so if we look at that, first of all, I want to remind you of something, which is actually conflict is not the central issue. It's not that people have conflict. It's that people have differences. Conflict is a result of the fact that people have differences. And so it's how families, groups, relationships manage when they have their differences that determines whether it's going to lead to conflict or it's going to lead to a productive process. But conflict is not primary. What is primary is differences. And so families that accept differences and have a healthy openness to the plurality of views and have an ability to listen when somebody is saying something that you differ with or disagree with is a key factor of the family again. And here I want to make reference to something. I developed this obviously some time back. Families that manage well distinguish the idea from the person. And we heard that yesterday, didn't we? One of the best lines, and I'm going to paraphrase this here. You heard with the interview, the two young ladies that were up here. And what did she say? She said something to the equivalent of, we all know that ideas are not safe, but that we are. As people, we are safe. Our ideas may not have to be. Do you remember that? It was brilliant. And it was exactly what we're talking about. That when you don't have a blaming culture, and that if you have an idea that I disagree with, that I'm going to be mad at you and think poorly of you, you have a family that can learn from their differences and from the conflicts. And so families embrace their differences, and they have both structures that encourage a plurality of views. You know, they have family councils, in a sense, governance structures. One of the purposes of governance is to bring forward and to manage differences. And so an effective process that stifles differences or trades differences and conflict for enforced harmony cannot learn as well as an enterprise that embraces and accepts and looks for differences, because that's where the information is. And so there is appropriate representation from family branches, leaders, generations. The governance structures are set up in such a way to encourage and tolerate that there's going to be differences. There may be independent board members who have different opinions and views. And now, again, it's about you guys, and they have good advisors. Because you may have different views than what the family is looking at or talking about. But in addition to the structures, they have processes that encourage the plurality of views. And we sort of have talking about these. The neither rushing nor bogging down in decision making. That teams that develop experience working together and trusting each other over time as they do, so that I can speak up and I can say something to you and you can say something to me, and we know that we can be safe together and we can do this and we're going to listen to each other. That's a great process in a team that works well together. And families that are able to handle one of the key dilemmas of families and family enterprises, which is, how do we balance our value of trying to include as many voices and as people as possible, while setting a threshold and having a bar, which is that you must have competencies. Because the minute you start creating a threshold that you have to have certain skills or competencies to be on the family council or in some other governance aspect, you're not going to be including some people. And families often struggle around the competency inclusion challenge, including in the business. So, as we start to, I'm going to remind you a little bit about good negotiation skills, which I think are an important skill for families. What's often called principled negotiation or interest-based negotiation, and knowing how to focus on interests rather than positions. If you are not familiar with this, this is the old Fisher and Urey getting to yes kind of stuff. That was like way back in those dog years of 1992. There are a tremendous number of materials. The Harvard program on negotiation. You can sign up for their email newsletter for free and get a lot of stuff every day and learn. I would strongly encourage you, as families as well as advisors, to learn as much as you can about modern negotiating technique, because it's a tremendous set of skills. But I want to draw your attention to something else, which is, because of the unique nature of family enterprises, where values come into play so much in strongly held beliefs. There's a great book by some colleagues, Doug Baumel and Blair Tripp, have just recently published in the last year a book called Deconstructing Conflict. How many are familiar with Deconstructing Conflict as a book? A few of you here and there. I would encourage you to take a look at it, and they also, it's Continuity Family Business Consulting based out of Massachusetts. They have a variety of blogs and materials. One of the things that they talk about in this book is that you have to go beyond interest-based negotiation, because often the source of a lot of rifts and conflicts in families are because people feel that they're defending their values. And when you get differences in values, things get difficult. People are going to defend their values. And if they feel disrespected around their position or authority or their values, this is where family relationships start to get very difficult and start to tear apart. And Doug and Blair have done a really good job of identifying some of the components that lead to really bad family rifts and stuck places. And they talk about what may need to be done for family enterprises and family conflicts. So it's a good book. So, this is where we began. A learning organization is skilled at creating, acquiring, and transferring knowledge, and at modifying its behavior. It's an effective process across generations. And we come back, now you can see why, when I looked at the FEX Learning Continuum, I saw so many of those components here. But the idea is the family has to go and rise above the individual members who may be doing learning. to taking on some of the structures and processes that lead to being a family that can cross multiple generations. And now we bring everybody together, because you can also see as advisors, as you are walking alongside these families and helping them and providing information and sometimes support and encouragement and sometimes differences in views. And so your role is incredibly valuable to the families that you work with at the individual level for their independence, and at the family level for their interdependence. And what is the purpose of it all? What, over time, is the reason why this is so important? Well, much, again, of my writing and my interest with families has led to one fundamental concept, which I believe is the quality and the goal of successful family enterprises. And in a way, Charles Darwin said it best: it's not the strongest that survives or the most intelligent. It's the one most adaptable to change. Adaptation is what families need to keep in front of them. Families that are adaptable, using the processes that we've talked about, tend to do well. And families that lose that capacity, that adaptability, tend to become at risk. And that's why we're talking about it this morning. And that's what this symposium is about. And so we have horror stories at difficult times like beer money. But for many families, they're able to escape that and keep going with an adaptable mindset. For you families in the room, I hope that this has been helpful to you, what you need to think about with your family. And for you advisors in the room, I hope that this gives you a little bit more of a big picture of what your role is and what you can be for the families that count on you. And I thank you for having me come and talk to you this morning about it.